Hello everyone and welcome to week 10 of English 200, 201, and 202. This week we're going to begin our fiction section. So please begin by reading Destination Fiction. That's just pages 109 and 110, just introduces a genre to us. And then read chapter 7, Description and Setting, pages 111 to 123. Now, there's not a lot of writing exercises this week because this week I would like for you to read Florida by Lauren Groth. Oops, I totally spelled her name wrong right there. I'm sorry, it's Groth. She wrote a fascinating book of short stories called Florida that are all set in the state of Florida, where she moved with her husband. And she started writing these short stories because she hated living in Florida, but they became, she wrote them over the course of 10 years. So we're going to talk a little bit about Lauren Groth and how she uses setting in these stories, and then you're going to be writing based on one of her short stories. But before we do so, I want to talk a little bit about the short story as a form. So welcome to your next genre, fiction. Yay, this is our third one. The word fiction means to shape or fashion. So when you think about writing fiction, you really are shaping or fashioning story around something. It's a way to think about it is kind of like sculpture. You're finding within the stone, you're finding the human figure that emerges. So there's literary fiction and then there's genre fiction. And there are some blurry lines between the two. Like, for example, one of my favorite authors, Octavia Butler, writes science fiction, but it's considered literary fiction because of the way she writes it. Ursula Le Guin, another one of my favorite authors, also writes science fiction, but in a way that is literary. We will be writing literary fiction in this course, probably avoiding some of the literary. So the other thing about genre fiction is many times it uses kind of like stock formats. You know, like a fantasy novel has a stock way of writing itself, and or a romance novel, right? You want to avoid stock, a stock way of doing it, a real cliched way of doing it. Just like in poetry or creative nonfiction, you want to write in a way that's inspiring, okay? That's just the bottom line. The elements of fiction are structure and design, the plot. So what happens, what caused those things to happen, and you want to keep it really simple in a short story, okay? Characters. These are the people in your story, including the main character, the protagonist, and the person, place, or thing that's working against that character, the antagonist. Dialogue is what the characters say to each other. And dialogue is not like everyday speech, and we will work on that later this semester, but you only want to write, when someone speaks in a story, they should only say what's absolutely necessary. You don't need to hear like all the random things that we say throughout our day. Setting is where and when a story takes place, and we'll see how important that is in the short stories found in Florida. Point of view, tone, and style. The tone is an attitude toward the listener, and the point of view is who and how the story is told. So Ron Carlson is a really interesting writer, excellent short story writer, and he wrote a book called Ron Carlson Writes a Story, and here's some quotations from it. You don't want to try to tell too many stories at once. A story that is too complicated uses up its energy just to explain what's happening. Now think about it. Say you were writing a story and the setting is just really, really complex, and you spend, it's a 2-page story, but you spend, or like a 4-page story, but you spend 3/4 of it just describing the setting, okay? That's not an appropriate way to, balance your short story. You really, really want to balance out how much time you spend on the setting or something else in the story. Don't write a last line that surprises the reader. So don't write this really great story and then end it because you're like stuck by saying, and then I woke up, or you know what I mean, like it was all a dream, right? That's not a good way to end a short story. It's a cheap trick, okay? Don't write about things that you don't know about, all right? It's easier to just write from your experience, but you can write about things you don't know about, but do the research, like understand it. Don't write a story whose main point is told from some unexpected point of view. That often doesn't work. Don't write stories that are simply idea-driven, right? You need real people in your stories. Don't overpopulate your stories with characters, though. Don't have too many people so we don't know what's going on, especially in short stories. And don't give your characters names that sound similar, okay? Keep it and don't choose like really weird names, right? Like make it appropriate to the story. Don't spend the first 2 pages of a story explaining your story. I've already mentioned that. Don't outline or plan out your entire story. Let the story take you where it intends to go. And don't be afraid not to be the one driving the car. Maybe sit in the back seat and let the story drive you along. Write toward what you know. And a writer goes into a story with a dream or a vision that is the North Star, and an understanding of craft that is the footing, and instinct, passion that is the driving force. I think that's a really great quote from Ron Carlson. If an idea matters to you, then it is worthy of your exploration. If you don't want to read the story, it's not worth writing. Okay? Make sure that this is the story that you focus on. Make sure it's worth spending your time on. Okay? All right. There's a lot of parts to a short story. There's the exposition, and this is where it's the beginning of the story, where you state the situation of the story, you tell us what the setting is, and you introduce us to the main characters. That always happens in the beginning of the story. There should be some sort of conflict or crisis. The main crisis of the story, which usually involves complications, and a main crisis action. The main conflict or crisis always involves the protagonist and the antagonist in some way. There's always a falling action. This is what happens as a result of the crisis. And then finally there'll be a resolution, and that's how the story resolves. No solution is usually offered in modern fiction. Okay, you don't have to make this like a lesson learned situation. Here's 2 types of stories. The story is a journey. So this is where an insider encounters the other, or self versus the other, and it needs to have a dynamic character, some character that changes over time. You'll see some of these in Lauren Graff's stories. Story as power struggle. It's based on a conflict or crisis and resolution. It's either the protagonist versus the antagonist, where both parties have equal force, and it can even just happen within the protagonist's mind. You should write what you know. Fiction's based on what you've observed, and is also writing about what you know. Fiction written from research about topics that interest you. That's another way you could do it. Or fiction written solely from your imagination. If you want your fiction to live, though, it needs to be something immediate and human. You need it to really, you want your reader to really feel the way the protagonist changes in your story. You always want to set the scenes. The setting is where and when a story takes place. It's important for highlighting the characters and their conflicts. You want to use as much specific detail and sensory detail as possible so the reader really feels what it's like to be there. In these short stories by Lauren Graff, you really feel what it's like to be in Florida from the perspective of the characters of her story, okay? And know that setting can be a character. 2 great examples of this are Jack London's To Build a Fire, 1908, and Kate Chopin's The Storm. All right, so that gets us to Journal 13. You're going to begin by reading Lauren Graff's short story collection, Florida. It's worth your time, guys. This is your only writing exercise this week, so spend your time reading this short story collection. And then, after you've read it, I want you to answer the following. I want you to choose one of the stories that really speaks to you in some way, and then answer the following questions about it. What happens in the story? Tell me what happens, like who the protagonist is, what the crisis is, what the setting is, what happens, and how you connect with this story, okay? Then I want you to look under the hood of the story. How does Lauren Groff achieve what she achieves in this short story? What devices does she use? How does she use sensory detail? Like, get under the hood and try to understand how she does what she does. Then I want you to try and write a short story where you mimic some aspect of what she does in her story. Your short story needs to be at least 500 words. All right, guys? That's it for this week. I really hope you enjoy reading Lauren Groff's short story collection. She really is a brilliant writer, and I think we can learn a lot by looking closely at her short stories. Please make sure you also watch the 2 videos that I posted. Those will really help you understand her work in more detail. As always, if you have questions, stop by my office hours. You can also stop by if you want to work on your poems or short stories or creative nonfiction essays for the Justman West contest. Remember, that's coming up, and you are required to enter it, so get working on it. All right, that's it for next week. For this week, I look forward to seeing you online and hopefully seeing some of you in my office hours.